Hello everyone, and welcome to this edition of History with Sai. We've come a long way, from the city of Babylon's early beginnings to its first real period of greatness under Hammurabi, followed by the relatively stable and prosperous Kassite period, which later led to over a century of Assyrian rule. Now, we come to the really short, though arguably most famous period in Babylonian history, that of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. If you've seen or even listened to a handful of programs on this channel, especially those focused on the history of ancient Mesopotamia and the Levant past the Mid-Bronze Age, then you've no doubt heard of the Assyrians. We've encountered them several times in the history of the region from around 2000 BCE onward. By the early Iron Age, they had established what scholars call the Neo-Assyrian Empire and ruled unchallenged across the Fertile Crescent for several centuries. What we call the Neo-Assyrian period kicked off around 911 BCE. Between the years 745 to about 650 BCE, Assyria was at its height and firmly entrenched in Babylonia, the land to its south. Though there were several periods of rebellion, the Assyrians were always able to smash any dissent and rule the country, either directly or through proxies and puppet rulers. Unfortunately, establishing such control at times also resulted in the city of Babylon being destroyed and having to be rebuilt on several occasions. The last great king of Assyria, Ashurbanipal, died around the year 630 BCE, which left the Assyrian Empire in the hands of his young heir, Ashur-etil-ilani. Too young to rule on his own, for a while, the chief eunuch, who was not a member of the royal family, took over as regent before usurping the throne for himself around 626 or 625 BCE. He, though, only lasted for a few months before being replaced by Sin-shara-ishkun, another one of Ashurbanipal's sons. By then, though, the apparent weakness and instability within Assyria's ruling house had taken its toll on many parts of the empire. In 627 BCE, Assyria's puppet ruler in Babylon, Kandalanu, died, leaving the Babylonian throne unoccupied. Babylonian Chronicle 21 states that for 1 year there was no king in the country, after which a new ruler by the name of Nabopolassar, better known to us as Nabopolassar, started his reign on the 26th day of the month Arasamnu, which on the Western Gregorian calendar would have fallen on November 23rd, 626 BCE. Obviously, the Assyrian king at the time, Sin-shara-ishkun, didn't recognize Nabopolassar and chased him south all the way to the city of Uruk. Many believe that Nabopolassar's family may have actually been from there, and so the city, which was in the Sealand province and a Chaldean stronghold, would have provided the new king with some shelter and protection against his Assyrian adversaries. For a few years, the two sides seemed to have battled over the city before at last Nabopolassar could claim a final victory there. By 620 BCE, it appears that he was in control of most, if not all, of Babylonia, including the holy city of Nippur. This, though, didn't necessarily mean that Babylon and Babylonia were safe. While the Assyrians had been weakened, centuries of conflict between the two great rivals had shown that a resurgent Assyria could return at any time. One only had to look at the last century for examples of Assyria's vengeance on Babylon. The most notable instances, just in recent memory, being Sennacherib's destruction of the city around 681 BCE, as well as Ashurbanipal's conquest a few decades later in a civil war against his brother, Shamash-shum-ukin. There was little that Nabopolassar could actually do. This was the Assyrian Empire we're talking about, the most powerful state in the known world at the time, that stretched from the Zagros Mountains in the east to the shores of Egypt and the Mediterranean in the west. Thinking that he could forever dislodge his northern neighbor from the scene was wishful thinking at best. It just so happened, though, that unlikely allies appeared when least expected. These were the Medes, an Iranian people who occupied large parts of the Zagros Mountains as well as the western Iranian plateau. The two regional powers eventually struck a deal with the clear objective of eliminating Assyrian influence from the region once and for all. Heavy fighting between the Babylonians and the Assyrians started in 616 BCE. The Babylonians were eventually able to advance all the way to the region of Arapa and then lay siege to the great city of Ashur in the heart of Assyria. The Assyrians, though, counterattacked and pushed the Babylonian forces back to what is today the area of Tikrit in Iraq. It was at this point that the Medes entered the scene. They also fought their way into the region of Arapa and advanced to the city of Ashur in 614 BCE. This time, though, the city fell, with the Medes completely razing it to the ground. Shortly after this event, Nabopolassar and the main Babylonian army arrived at Ashur, where he met the Median king, Sayachares, face to face. There, the two kings made a formal alliance before heading their separate ways. They met again in the summer of 612 BCE, when the Babylonians and Medes joined forces to take out the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, at that time perhaps the most beautiful and wealthy city in the world. After a 3-month siege, it fell, along with the Assyrian king, Sin-shara-ishkun. Despite losing the major centers of their homeland, the remnants of the Assyrian Empire fought on in the west. The new, and soon-to-be last Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit II, reorganized what was left of his forces at the cities of Carchemish and Haran, sites today located in northern Syria. With his Egyptian allies, the Assyrians fought hard, but eventually lost to the Babylonian-Median coalition. And with the fall of Haran in 610 BCE, what was left of the Assyrian Empire was wiped off the map forever. The fall of Assyria, for most in the ancient Near East, would have been unimaginable just a generation before. When it fell, few mourned its passing, though many sought to pick up the pieces of what was left of its once great empire. After the fall of Haran, Nabopolassar campaigned in the Levant around Carchemish, which the Egyptians also sought to control. In 605 BCE, his son, Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar, won a decisive battle against the Egyptians that allowed Babylon to essentially move forward in its control of the entire Levant. Shortly after this, Nabopolassar died, and the crown prince was coronated as Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. Though Nabopolassar was arguably one of the greatest freedom fighters of his time, by his own account, he was a humble man who prided himself not on his conquests, but his piety and willingness to be part of a greater divine plan. One of his inscriptions reads,
"When I was young, although I was the son of nobody, I constantly sought the sanctuaries of my lords, the gods Nabu and Marduk. My mind was preoccupied with the establishment of their prescriptions and the complete performance of their rituals. My attention was directed at justice and equity. The god Marduk, the Lord who fathoms the hearts of the gods of heaven and the netherworld, who constantly observes the conduct of mankind, perceived my inner thoughts and elevated me, the servant who was anonymous among the people, to a high status in the country in which I was born. He called to me the lordship over the country and the people. He caused a benevolent protective spirit to walk at my side. He let me succeed in everything I undertook."
In another text, he gives some advice to the kings who would come after him.
"Any king at any time, whether a son or a grandson who will succeed me, and whose name Marduk will call to exert rulership of the country, do not be concerned with feats of might and power. Seek the sanctuaries of Nabu and Marduk, and let them slay your enemies. The Lord Marduk examines utterances and scrutinizes the heart. He who is loyal to Marduk, his foundations will endure. He who is loyal to the son of Marduk will last for eternity."
The new king Nebuchadnezzar spent the next few years marching through the Levant, conquering any areas that refused to recognize him as their new overlord, and collecting substantial sums of tribute, much of which was later used to beautify the capital city of Babylon, something which we'll get to shortly. Most of the former Western Assyrian provinces fell into line rather quickly and easily. In their case, it was just a change in management at the top. It was in the southern Levant that the Babylonians encountered stiff resistance. Babylonian Chronicles from the year 604 BCE report that Nebuchadnezzar marched against the city of Ashkelon, captured its king, and then plundered the city before razing it to the ground, which has also been confirmed by archaeology. The most famous kingdom, though, to suffer Nebuchadnezzar's wrath was the Kingdom of Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem. In 601 BCE, Judah's king, Jehoiakim, openly challenged Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's response came a few years later, in 598 or 597 BCE, with an assault on Jerusalem.
The 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar. In the month of Kislevu, the king of Akkad mustered his troops, marched to the Levant, and set up his quarters facing the city of Judah. In the month of Adaru, the 2nd day, he took the city and captured the king. He installed there a king of his choice. He collected its massive tribute and went back to Babylon.
Jehoiakim died during the siege and was quickly succeeded by his son, Jehoiakim, but he was captured and taken prisoner to Babylon as a hostage. In the Babylonian archives, there's an actual receipt that mentions Jehoiakim along with members of his family as the recipients of sesame oil. It reads,
32 pints for Jehoiakim, king of Judah, 5 pints for the sons of the king of Judah, 8 pints for 8 men of Judah, 1 pint each.
Though named as the king of Judah in the text, Nebuchadnezzar installed Jehoiakim's uncle, Zedekiah, as the vassal ruler of Judah. It wasn't long though before Zedekiah also revolted against Nebuchadnezzar. Our only source for this is the Hebrew Bible, because the specific Babylonian chronicle for that period, Chronicle 24, ends around the year 594 BCE. The story goes that Nebuchadnezzar marched again on Judah and held the city of Jerusalem under siege for 2 years before capturing it, and this time destroying it along with its great temple, which scholars believe all occurred in the year 586 BCE. In addition, he took an even greater percentage of the population back to Babylonia with him as exiles. Judah, though, wasn't the only land to suffer. Shortly afterward, Nebuchadnezzar seems to have meted out the same fate to both Ammon and Moab. Scholars have speculated that all of these regions were subject to a sort of scorched earth policy because the Babylonians were also at war with the Egyptians and didn't want them to gain a hold of any territory in the Levant. In fact, the only rebellious land or city that completely escaped subjugation, at least for a time, was the Phoenician city-state of Tyre, the main part of which was located on an island and evaded capture. After a reportedly 13-year-long siege, its king came to an agreement with Nebuchadnezzar where Tyre was allowed to be ruled by local kings in return for vassalage and the use of its large fleet, which essentially became the Babylonian Navy. Though the Babylonian armed forces were campaigning and causing havoc to the west, there was peace and prosperity at home. This allowed Nebuchadnezzar to commission many building projects that essentially transformed Babylon into once again the world's most beautiful and wealthy city. Though there's little evidence of the famous Hanging Gardens, plenty of textual information has been found at the site of ancient Babylon and other cities detailing all of the temples, palaces, elaborate gardens, and defensive wall restorations that Nebuchadnezzar II commissioned. In one text, the Babylonian king himself describes how he was active in the city's renovation.
This street of Babylon having become increasingly lower, I pulled down the gates and relaid their foundations at the water table with asphalt and bricks. I had them remade of bricks with blue stone, on which wonderful bulls and dragons were depicted. I covered their roofs by laying majestic cedars lengthwise over them. I fixed doors of cedarwood, trimmed with bronze in all of the gates. I placed wild bulls and ferocious dragons in the gateways, and thus adorned them with luxurious splendor, so that mankind might gaze on them in wonder.
Though it's believed that he himself didn't visit the city, Herodotus in the 5th century BCE wrote of Babylon's vast size and grandeur according to what he'd probably heard from others.
The city stands on a broad plain, and is an exact square, 120 stadia in length each way, so that the entire circuit is 480 stadia. While such is its size and magnificence, there is no other city that approaches to it. It is surrounded, in the first place, by a broad and deep moat, full of water, behind which rises a wall 50 royal cubits in width and 200 in height.
It wasn't just Babylon that benefited from such programs, but also cities such as Borsippa, where the god Nabu's main temple was, and Uruk. Most of this, of course, was funded from the spoils of Nebuchadnezzar's many conquests. Nebuchadnezzar died in late 562 BCE and was succeeded by his son, Amel-Marduk, whose short reign of only 2 years started the gradual decline of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It's perhaps for this reason that the Babylonian historian Berosus, writing in Greek in the 4th century BCE, claims that he was killed by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar, who then seized the throne for himself and reigned as king for 4 years. Documents discovered at Uruk have led some scholars to believe that Neriglissar had married a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, named Kashea, which may have helped to have supported his claim to the throne. During those 4 years, he campaigned in Cilicia and also claimed to have crossed into Lydia, the most powerful kingdom of Western Anatolia at that time. However, he died shortly after his return to Babylon and was succeeded by his son, Labashi-Marduk, who only reigned for a few weeks before he himself was ousted and replaced by the man who would become the last true king of Babylon, Nabonidus. It appears that Nabonidus was originally a high-ranking court official, and a very learned one at that. According to Berosus, he was involved in a conspiracy that removed Labashi-Marduk from power, after which he was made king. It's very possible that Nabonidus' family was not completely Babylonian, at least not from his mother's side. Nabonidus claimed that his father was Nabopolassar Ikbi, of whom he just says was a wise prince. His mother, though, whose name was Adad Gupi, appears to have come from the city of Haran shortly after the fall of the Assyrian Empire and served in the courts of Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar II, and Neriglissar, during which time it's likely that she introduced her son, Nabonidus, at court. Eventually, Nabonidus probably rose up through the ranks to an influential position within Babylonian society. There is a theory that Adad Gupi had originally been an Assyrian priestess of the moon god, Sin, and that it's from her that Nabonidus developed his own devotion to the deity. In fact, Haran was known as being a major center for worship of the god, though Sin's primary sanctuary was in the city of Ur. Nabonidus went on pilgrimages and retreats where he worshipped the god Sin exclusively and restored many of the deity's sanctuaries across his empire. In fact, Nabonidus was so focused on this that he appointed his son, Belshazzar, better known as Belshazzar, to rule as regent while he was away, which according to Babylonian Chronicles and other documents from the time, was quite often. The priesthood in Babylon, as well as perhaps the thousands of devotees to the city's patron god, Marduk, took notice of this and obviously felt the excessive favor and devotion that Nabonidus was showing towards Sin were an affront to their own religion. In the spring of his 3rd year as king, or 553 BCE, Nabonidus went on a campaign that took him into northern Arabia, where he ended up at the oasis of Tema. Using the town as a base, Nabonidus claims that he spent 10 years in northern Arabia, during which time Belshazzar ran the government as regent and carried out the religious obligations that normally would have been the duty of the Babylonian king himself. While Nabonidus' campaigns in northern Arabia may have resulted in an expansion of Babylonian territory and regional influence, things were also afoot in Iran and western Anatolia. Babylon's neighbor and ally, the Median Empire, went through a regime change in Nabonidus' 6th year when the relatively unknown Cyrus, the king of Anshan, overthrew his Median overlord, King Astyages, around 550 BCE. Babylonian Chronicle number 7, also known as the Nabonidus Chronicle because it covers the reign of Nabonidus, states,
Astyages called up his armed forces and went against Cyrus, the king of Anshan, for purposes of conquest. As for Astyages, his army rebelled against him, and he was taken into custody. They presented him to Cyrus. Cyrus went to the land of Ecbatana, the royal city, and silver, gold, goods and property, which he carried away as spoils from Ecbatana, he took to Anshan.
The Babylonians had technically been in an alliance with the Median Empire ever since they went through their joint venture of putting an end to Assyria. Since then, Haran, which as mentioned before was a cult center of the moon god Sin, had been in the hands of the Medes since the city's capture in 610 BCE. Nabonidus though desired the city and wished to restore Sin's temple there, known as the Uhulhul, to its former glory. There's a very interesting clay cylinder found in Sippar called the Cylinder of Nabonidus, which supposedly recalls a dream that the king had where both the gods Marduk and Sin command him to rebuild the Uhulhul. Though it was probably a work of propaganda intended to justify Nabonidus' spending of government funds to rebuild an old, dilapidated temple in faraway Haran, it's nevertheless a fascinating work. Part of the text reads,
In the beginning of my everlasting reign, they sent me a dream. The great lord Marduk and Sin, the luminary of heaven and the netherworld, stood together. Marduk spoke with me. Nabonidus, king of Babylon, carry bricks on your riding horse, build a Uhulhul, and cause the great lord Sin to establish his residence in its midst. Reverently I spoke to the Enlil of the gods, Marduk. That temple which you ordered me to build, the Mede surrounds it, and his might is excessive. Marduk spoke with me. The Mede whom you mentioned, he, his country, and the kings who march at his side will be no more. At the beginning of the 3rd year they aroused him. Cyrus, the king of Anshan, his second in rank, scattered the vast Median hordes with his small army. He captured Astyages, the king of the Medes, and took him to his country as captive. Such was the word of the great lord Marduk, and of Sin, the luminary of heaven and the underworld, whose command cannot be changed.
In the end, it seems that Nabonidus, and I suppose the gods Marduk and Sin, got what they wanted, since the Babylonian king was able to restore the Uhulhul. Cyrus may have replaced Astyages, allowing Nabonidus to take Haran, but that didn't mean that things were about to go back to normal. On the contrary, Nabonidus' days were numbered. Cyrus, the king of Anshan, and with a new united Persian Median Empire, turned his attention to western Anatolia, where he defeated Croesus of Lydia and annexed his kingdom along with the Greek city-states of Ionia. According to Herodotus, the Lydians and Babylonians had made an alliance against Cyrus, and Croesus seems to have expected their help before Cyrus arrived at his capital of Sardis. If Herodotus' account is true, then it's possible that this was all the justification that the Persian king needed to launch an attack on Babylonia. In 543 BCE, Nabonidus hastily returned to Babylon and ordered that the statues of the gods and goddesses from other sanctuaries, including Sippar and Uruk, be brought to the city for safekeeping. Such actions imply that Nabonidus was expecting a long siege. However, that's not what happened in the end. Perhaps due to collusion from Babylonian citizens, army officers, and a priesthood that was fed up because of Nabonidus' apparent disrespect of their patron god Marduk, Cyrus was able to march through Babylonia almost unopposed, with the only armed encounter recorded being at the town of Opis on the Tigris River. After that, at least according to the Chronicle, it's pretty clear what happened next.
In the month Tashritu, on the 14th day, Sippar was captured without battle. Nabonidus fled. On the 16th day, Gubaru, governor of Gutium, and the army of Cyrus without a battle entered Babylon. Afterwards, after Nabonidus retreated, he was captured in Babylon. Interruption of rites in Esagila or the temples there was none, and no date was missed. On the 3rd day of the month Arasamnu, Cyrus entered Babylon. They filled the Haru vessels in his presence. Peace was imposed on the city. The proclamation of Cyrus was read to all of Babylon.
According to Berosus, Cyrus had Nabonidus exiled to Karmania, today in the province of Kerman in southwestern Iran. Another tradition maintains that he was appointed as an advisor to the new king. And that is how the Neo-Babylonian Empire came to an end. From then onward, there would be no other native rulers of the city of Babylon. Starting with the Persians, then Macedonians, Greeks, Parthians, Sasanians, and so forth, Babylon would be part of, but never the center of the many states and empires that would go on to rule over Mesopotamia. However, mention of the name Babylon still captures our imagination, and the legacy of the Babylonians, whose capital city it was for generations, is still with us today in the form of contributions to mathematics, sciences such as astronomy and medicine, philosophy, religion, literature, and art. So, I hope that you've enjoyed this program on the history of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. I also really want to thank Danny Hussain for bringing these historical figures and chronicles to life with his voice. Thanks also to all of you for stopping by. If you learned something or simply just enjoyed the video, please don't hesitate to hit that like button because it really helps the channel out a lot. Check out the History with Sai podcast, where I go into more detail with regard to some of the topics discussed on the channel. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Take care and stay safe.